He starts into a discourse that we've already begun. But I say to those who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. To him who strikes you on one cheek, offer the other also. Just to put this into context with the culture, this is written in the time of an ancient Jewish culture. The worst insult you could do to a Jewish person would be to backhand them in the face. Worst thing you could do, worse than any words, worse than a full-out punch. The ultimate insult. So Jesus is saying this crazy thing. He's saying if somebody hits you with the ultimate insult, even just offer them the other cheek. Just so far beyond the human level. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who asks of you. And from him who takes away your goods, do not ask for them back. And just as you want men to do to you, you also do to them likewise. They're just sandwiched in all this impossible stuff. We have the saying, the maxim itself in the saying. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. Keep in mind, this philosophy is in Jesus' time. People have already said, don't do the wrong thing to other people. Jesus is just pointing out this. He said, anybody can do that. What credit to you is it if you simply do what anyone else would do? And if you lend to those whom you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be the sons of the Most Highest. For he is kind to the unthankful and evil. Therefore be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. This will not make any sense to someone who is not in a relationship with God, who isn't in a living relationship with God. It is just nuts. And for the rest of us, it's impossible, but we'll get on with that. As we talk, all this stuff, why do it? It's so crazy. Love those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who are spiteful. Those who deliver the worst insults, don't fire back. Don't demand payback. Actually be ready to give more. This stuff is just way out there. Of course it is. It makes no sense in human terms, but we're not talking human terms. We're talking the sons of the Most High. A differentiation from the world in general to sons of the Most High. This is the whole thing. Why bother? Going to really hit you with 3 reasons, but first let me give you a little background on why bother with this crazy stuff. Why bother with it at all? Jesus says, your reward will be great. Well, that's wonderful. And you will be sons of the highest. But what exactly does that mean? Here's where we get into really basic core Christianity. What's Christianity really all about? You know what? It's not about the fact you believe in God. That's good. But no, it's not the fact that you do good things or you're a good person. Because, well, if we really got into deep theology, you know what? You're really not. Neither am I. The whole thing of Christianity is spiritual life. Why does somebody enter the presence of God after death? They see him in heaven, or however you want to put it. Because they are spiritually alive. That's the difference. Why do we not go there? Because we're spiritually dead. And the truth is, we all were born spiritually dead. Take us back to the beginning of this. What happened in the garden? Forget apples and all that stuff. Even literal fruit, who knows? Man would know good from evil. The moment you did, you would die. The moment you did, you would die. Well, Adam didn't die right away. Eve didn't die right away. So what's going on here? They died spiritually. What does that mean? There was a disconnect with God. There was some way that they walked with him in the evening. There was a connection. They thought, they felt, they understood God. In spiritual death, you no longer understand God, and that's where we are all born. Sure, you can have your own moral code. Sure, you can try and live up to it, which no one ever really does, but you cannot understand God. Why? Quite simple, you're spiritually dead. Christianity is all about being spiritually alive and showing that life. That is what it's all about. Well, can you back that up? Sure. Ephesians 1. Paul talking to the Ephesian church. And in this beginning of this letter, he says this, and you he made alive. Not you he made good, not you he saved so much in this. You he made alive. Well, why did he have to make me alive? Who were dead in trespasses and sins, who were dead spiritually, in which you once walked according to the course of this world. Sin brings death. We're born in sin. Sin is a nature. It's a status before it is any kind of action. We're all born spiritually dead. Nothing new in that. That's basic Christianity. Spiritual death looks like mean tweets. Spiritual death is not understanding why and how God does what he does. The golden rule is simply a sign of life, as God teaches it. Not man's, but God's. Do unto others is simply a sign of life. You are acting like God in this. And that brings us into these three things. So basically, when I give you three reasons why we do this crazy stuff that Jesus told us, is for these three reasons, which are all simply signs of spiritual life. If they're not there in your life or my life, then we need to really examine things. First thing, reason and sign of life is this: we will be like God. We will be like God. Almost sounds pretentious in itself, doesn't it? So something happens and say, man, you were just like God when you did that. Yes, I was just like God. Sounds pretentious, but think of what even the word Christian means. It means little Christ. Christian, the word, means little Christ. In some of the earliest catechisms and the earliest teachings that we find, I love this from backed by all kinds of scripture in the Anglican or Episcopal Shorter Catechism. They just lay it out here. Question: what is the chief end of man? In other words, what is the purpose of mankind? For everyone, what is the purpose? Answer: man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And I think I put on there in the footnotes a whole bunch of scriptures, I think, on that one in the sheets. If not, I'll tell you them later. They make the point, but then it becomes this: what exactly is being said there? The word glorify is an interesting word, because essentially, when you look at the ancient meaning of the word, it meant to stamp an imprint on something. If you pull a penny or quarter or something, there'll be a face on there, and you go, oh, well, that's Abraham Lincoln. The image is stamped in with such clarity that you know who the person is. So the point of glorifying God is that those who are in this relationship with God are stamped with that image. And you say, well, I know that it's Jordy, but I can see God there in what he's doing, thinking, saying, whatever. The image is stamped in. That's his job. Did you know that everything else you do, Jordy, that's your main job in life? It's mine too. It's yours if you're a human being. It's our main job to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Revelation, of course, that's what is it all about. You go into God's presence, you enjoy him forever. For why? Because you're stamped with his image. You're in a living relationship. Sign of life. So is it so surprising that when we live in this world, whatever we do, we should look like God? We should look like him. It's a sign of life. Takes us into the second one. We will experience God. That's a little different. You'll look like him. Well, you know what? That's maybe somebody else gets to experience God through you, but you get to experience God. How so? How is this? 1 Peter 4:12. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice to the extent that you are partakers of Christ's sufferings. I don't know about you, but for years, when I was a Christian, I'd read that and I go, wow, that sure sounds holy, but it makes absolutely no sense. How can somebody rejoice? And, well, that's, I'm grateful Jesus suffered in the way he did, but why should I rejoice in that kind of suffering? That when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. When his glory is revealed. Now we know that you take the whole Bible as a whole, there's coming a time he comes back, we see him face to face, not in a mirror dimly, we know all of that. But that revealed isn't all then. There's a strange phenomena that happens to people now in what is being said, and we'll look at it in a bit. If you are reproached in the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory, that imprinting, and of God rests upon you. On their part, he is blasphemed. That's mean as far as the world is concerned, but on your part, he is glorified. The imprinting is going to show through when you partake in Christ's sufferings. What's going on here? This really strange phenomenon happens in the Christian life. And a lot of Christians do not understand this until they grow up a little bit. I remember, I'll just anecdote here with myself, fairly new in a real Christian faith back in college, go to this large youth conference called the Urbana. Some of you may be familiar. And for me, I'm really going to date myself here, Urbana 76. There I was. Billy Graham was there, all kinds of great actors, I was going to say. Too many mean tweets on my mind. There were all these great Christian servants that were there. And one lady, and I thought I had the name, and I look in the bio, it doesn't quite fit. But anyway, someone who was very well known as a Christian missionary. And this lady, back in the 70s, I think they weren't so quick to pull people out of countries when they were getting into turmoil and serious stuff. So anyway, this lady got stuck, and I believe it was in South America, but anyway, she got stuck in a civil war on the mission field. It had ended up that she's telling her story at this conference, and basically it came down to this, and she's telling in the first hand in terms that rebel soldiers took over the compound, and she was terribly brutalized by these soldiers in this event. And then she says, in all of this, in the very worst of it, in the very darkest part of it, she says, I have never felt God so close or so palpable, so present with me. And I was a very new Christian at the time. Man, that sounds whacked. All this terrible stuff is happening to her, and she's feeling a strong sense of God right in this violent stuff going on. What's going on? Well, I think today, if I were to put a term on it, I call it the Stephen experience. Remember Stephen and getting stoned in Acts? When he is about to be stoned, it says his face became like an angel, right? He was like he was looking right into heaven, and he saw the Son of Man. God was so palpable, so present, so intense in that situation that it showed on his face, and everyone around him noticed. This lady was basically saying the same thing. Here's the phenomenon that we're talking about in experiencing God. Not going out and looking for trouble, but I guarantee you this, that if you walk in a living faith, somewhere along your path, you're going to hit some really tough valleys. And sometimes those valleys will be there anyway, because hard things come to everybody's life. But these tough valleys, these deep valleys will come. And especially if it's something that happens to you just because you're holding on to God, just because you are imprinted with the image of Christ, it's even worse. In the physical situation, it's even harder. Or maybe you wouldn't even be there like this missionary lady. You wouldn't even be there if you weren't being obedient to God. And like she was saying, I have never felt God so close, so intense before or after. That was the lowest point in her life, and that's when God was the closest. God the closest when we're in the Stephen experience. Wow, how does that work? Well, it had to be explained to the Hebrew church too, because coming out of Judaism, they didn't have all the dynamics of a personal relationship like many of us just take for granted today. And to the Hebrew church, Hebrews 2:18, it was expressed like this: for in that he himself has suffered being tempted, he is able to aid those who are tempted. Now keep in mind what they were used to religiously. In the temple, the priests, well, let's say if it was our day, you show up at the temple in your Volkswagen and the priest drives in with his big Cadillac. You know, you have your clothes from Walmart on. He's dressed in the finest linens from wherever they made tailor suits. He was way above. He didn't experience a lot of the stuff you went through. He was privileged because of his religious status. So to turn around and say to people, you're having it rough, aren't you? You know, here, take consolation in this. Your God, not just your priest alone, your God who is now your high priest, has gone through the very same thing. What consolation in this idea. Ever been there, ever gone through something and people just don't understand? And somebody who you trust, somebody you know, they just come up to you and say, you know, I was through that very same thing. I know it. I understand what you're going through. The consolation from that. It's that times 1,000 when we're dealing with God. He knows what you're going through. He has been through it himself. The verse says, has suffered, been tempted as we are tempted. Once again, to qualify a word, it's not just tempted as in entice. The word has another meaning like this. Imagine that you're going to cross over some high spot and there's a plank, there's a wooden board there that you have to cross. What would you do before you crossed? You know, you will probably give that a really good step on before you really trusted that board. And that's what it means to test something to make sure that it's trustworthy. So some of the things that we go through, just like Christ, are things in which we are being tested, or we are being proven, we are being grown. In the hardest times, we can experience God the most. That's the promise. A little implication I'd like to throw out from this reason, this number 2 reason we're talking about. Keep this in mind about God's power. God gives abundant power, but he doesn't give surplus power. God gives abundant power, but he doesn't give surplus power. Well, what does that mean? It means this. If you look at practically any story in Scripture, whoever, even like Stephen, where he's in an impossible situation, God supplied impossible power. But the impossible power wasn't there before he was in the situation. Churches all over our culture, you hear it, you maybe said it yourself, I know I have, sitting there in a pew, just, you know, that's basically the extent of my Christianity. Man, I'd love to experience power like that. Well, God gives you the power you need, not surplus. So he'll give you all the power you need to sit in that pew. He'll give you all the power you need to get up on Sunday morning and get here. But if you're talking this level of impossible power, this happens when God takes you to an impossible place and you go. He will give you the power for where you are active, where you are doing the do that Jesus talked about. Do unto others, do in life, live where God leads. You get the power for where you are, for what you're doing in obedience. To the Corinthian church, they needed some explanation too. So Paul, writing to them, put it this way, 2 Corinthians 12:9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. The strength isn't there when you feel like doing the right thing. It's there when you're doing the right thing. The strength is there when we are in action and the power is needed. So why do these impossible things, this level that we've been talking about of do unto others? Because you get to experience God in ways you don't get to experience him otherwise. Number 3, the third rule here, how we treat others is how God will treat us. Well, you know, we talk about salvation and being secure in it and all of this. Where does this line come in? This is spoken to Christian people who are, you know, even in prayer. Matthew 6:14, for if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. Verse 15, but if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive you your trespasses. Why would God be that way? Well, let's start with what he forgave you for and what he forgave me for. While we were yet enemies, God forgave us. Not that we love him, but that he first loved us. God has shown incredible forgiveness, incredible mercy, incredible love before we ever deserved it. Christian theology says not only do we believe in God, but God himself abides in us. He lives in us. We take on his nature. By nature, we should be forgiving in the way that he forgives. We should be doing in the way that he does. It's a sign of life. If it's not there, 1 John 4:20 tells you, you know what? You're lying to yourself. You can show up at church every Sunday. You can do all the right things and say all the right things and convince everybody in the world. But it says anyone who says they love God and yet hates, that is simply not treating them right, hates their neighbor, is a liar, and the first person we're lying to is ourselves. So here's where we are with principle number 6. We have this crazy level of forgiveness, of relationship, where we do unto others what we would have done to us. We look to their welfare and all of this. Impossible by human standards, so how do we make it happen? How do we make it happen? Well, in short, you don't. Guaranteed, if you go out from here and say, we have to do this, because that's where we are so far. Our Christianity is nothing. Our faith is nothing if this is void in the relationship. But it's impossible. You have to do it, but you can't. Well, so how do we do it? Well, we don't. If we go out, you and I, and try and live to God's standard on our own power, not going to work. It's not even scriptural. There's nothing that says we're supposed to go out and do the things that God tells us. We're to obey, but through his power. His power. 2 Corinthians 3:4. As we have such trust through Christ towards God, not that we are sufficient. Keep in mind who's writing this. This is the super rock star of Christianity. Here's the Apostle Paul writing to the church, and he says, even these people who you would think are the highest level of Christians, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think of anything as being from ourselves. Man, that's just silly. But our sufficiency is from God. Our sufficiency is from God. Trust through Christ. Well, okay, then what does trust mean? Confidence and reliance is the nutshell definition from the original word. Confidence and reliance. It's God who's going to do it, not you, not me. Just invite you to this. Let's put this phenomena to test a little bit. You know we're supposed to look like God. You know you can experience God. Ask yourself, well, let me just, I did it to the first service. I think I'll do it to you folks too. Who in here, no judgment on this, but who in here would say you are at this point in a living relationship with Christ? You're not perfect. I'm just saying you're in a living relationship. Okay, so the candle, I see over this row is not sure. You know, there's not too, so okay, that's fine. There's not too many hands going up there. Because this one thing will not make sense to anyone else. It only makes sense in a living relationship. The reliance is on that person you say you believe in. If you have been walking with them for any length of time, I invite you to think this, even in your own inventory. When have you felt the closest, strongest presence to God? When have you felt that? In the first service, not so many people, we got into talking, and there were some pretty deep stories, but every story was this: it was in the valleys. It was something that was humanly crushing. And I think where my mind went was a story shared, I think the last time I heard of this, a lady in Ohio, her daughter being brutalized and killed by some murderer they caught, and the lady face to face forgives this man. Now keep in mind, this doesn't make sense either until we look at what we talked about forgiveness already. Remember in the relationships, forgiveness isn't forgetting it or making light of it or it's not serious. It's the opposite of that. Forgiveness is in fact simply giving up one's right for revenge and vowing to let God deal with that, and you will, in your humanness, only look to the person's welfare. That's it. In forgiveness in this way, she forgave him. The rest of the world shakes their head. Well, of course the rest of the world should shake its head. In ourselves, we are spiritually dead. That's beyond our understanding even. And even as a Christian, I know you can sit there, most of us have children, thinking of somebody harming your child in some malicious way. How would you ever forgive? Well, let me say this. If you and I are in this living relationship, if that happened, if that was brought into our life and we were connected with God as we should be, we would have the power to forgive. God would make sure of it as we are in touch with him, as we're living the relationship. Hopefully none of us do. I hope I never get tested in that way. But this lady did. How did she do it? She understood, well, one thing from forgiveness, that if she didn't forgive, it was her who would be life in prison more than the prisoner himself who was going to prison. She knew she would be in her own prison, but she was a Christian. She's promised freedom. She could let it go and leave it with God. Whole thing, she was given the power to do that, eye to eye. This is the whole thing with these principles. You and I cannot do it, but in the power of Christ we can. Another thing we shared is we shared in the first service, knowing the people who were sharing there, I said, well, one thing is you didn't just jump into dealing with this at the moment. They had been walking with God all along. It's kind of like the time to learn to swim isn't when you're thrown into the ocean in the middle of a storm. Hopefully you learned somewhere before that. The time to prepare is before. That's where Warren's stuff comes in that we're looking at. He looks at the practices for a balanced life. But for us, for you, for me, even now, is it worth it? Does it work? Take a look at your own life. If you have honestly been walking with Christ for any length of time, just ask yourself that question. When did you feel God the closest? Chances are it wasn't a mountaintop experience. It was some valley. It's something the rest of the world wouldn't even understand why you were reacting in that way. It was peace when the world would say there should be no peace there. It was a freedom when there shouldn't have been any freedom there. It's in those times. But it takes principle number 6 to get there. Do unto others impossible without God. But do you want them that close? Do you want them that close?